Loneliness has often been described as a shadow that follows us even when we are surrounded by people. It is not simply about being physically alone, but about feeling unseen, unheard, and disconnected at a deeper level. Psychologists and psychoanalysts have long argued that loneliness represents one of the most painful emotional experiences a human being can endure because it strikes at the very core of what it means to exist. Irvin Yalom, in his book Existential Psychotherapy, reminds us that one of the fundamental givens of human existence is isolation. He describes it as a truth we cannot escape. No matter how close we get to another person, there is always an ultimate gap that separates one consciousness from another. This existential isolation is different from social or emotional loneliness. It is a recognition that, in the end, we are alone in facing life, death, and meaning itself. The silent weight of loneliness often remains invisible to others. A person can appear to have a vibrant social life, countless friends, or even a loving family, yet still carry an inner void that no one else can see. This contradiction was echoed by the psychoanalyst Winnicott, who spoke about the experience of being alone in the presence of others. For him, the capacity to be alone was not necessarily negative, but when it was experienced without an inner sense of security, it became deeply distressing. Imagine someone sitting at a dinner table surrounded by laughter and conversation, yet feeling like they are drifting on an island where no one truly reaches them. That is the silent, suffocating nature of loneliness. What makes loneliness particularly painful is its invisibility. Unlike a physical wound, there is no bandage, no visible mark to signal to the world that something is wrong. The individual suffering often fears judgment or rejection if they reveal their emptiness. They may even convince themselves that their pain is trivial compared to other struggles. And so, they keep silent. This silence only deepens the void, creating a cycle where isolation feeds more isolation. Rollo May, in Love and Will, pointed out that modern society often distracts itself with superficial connections or constant activity, not because people are truly fulfilled, but because they are desperately trying to escape the terror of being alone with themselves. He wrote, "Loneliness is the poverty of self, solitude is the richness of self." In those words, he captured the fragile line between loneliness as despair and solitude as growth. What psychologists also note is that loneliness is not just emotional, it has a profound impact on the body. Studies in recent decades have shown that chronic loneliness is linked to higher stress levels, weakened immune systems, and even shortened lifespans. But long before these scientific findings, psychoanalysts already understood the gravity of loneliness on the human spirit. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, described in Man's Search for Meaning how the absence of connection and purpose can make life feel unbearable. He observed that people who lacked a sense of belonging or meaning suffered far more than those who, even in isolation, carried within themselves a sense of purpose. His reflection underlines the fact that loneliness is not just about missing others. It is about missing meaning, missing a sense of being rooted in life. What makes the silent weight of loneliness so complex is that it can coexist with external success. A person may achieve professional recognition, financial stability, and admiration from peers, yet when the lights fade and the applause stops, they find themselves alone with an inner emptiness they cannot escape. This is why many artists, thinkers, and leaders have confessed to deep loneliness despite their public lives. The void they carry cannot be filled by accomplishments, possessions, or temporary distractions. As Yalom writes, loneliness is not cured by human company. Loneliness is cured by contact with reality, by understanding that we are part of something greater than ourselves. His words suggest that what alleviates loneliness is not simply having more people around, but finding authentic connections, whether with others, with meaning, or even with one's own true self. The silence of loneliness also shapes how people perceive themselves. Many internalize the belief that if they feel lonely, it must mean they are unworthy of love or inherently flawed. This self-criticism intensifies the sense of isolation, creating a barrier between the individual and the possibility of reaching out for help. Psychoanalysis often emphasizes that loneliness, while painful, is not a personal defect, but a universal human condition. To experience it does not mean one is broken, it means one is human. The tragedy is not in feeling lonely, it is in believing that one must face it in secrecy, as though it were a shameful burden. In this sense, unveiling loneliness means first breaking the silence that surrounds it. When we dare to name it, when we admit that the void exists, we take the first step toward lightening its weight. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung once suggested that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. His insight reveals that loneliness is less about numbers and more about depth. One true connection, where we feel understood, can begin to dissolve the heaviness of isolation. Loneliness, then, is a paradox. It is both invisible and overwhelming, silent yet deafening, deeply private yet universally shared. It weighs on hearts across all ages, cultures, and circumstances, binding us in an unspoken fraternity of human experience. To unveil loneliness is not to eliminate it, but to recognize it for what it is, a call to seek, to connect, and to find meaning beyond the emptiness. Only then does the silent weight begin to feel less like a burden and more like a signal, pointing us toward what we most deeply need: connection, authenticity, and the courage to face ourselves. When people describe loneliness, they often speak of it as emptiness, an inner hollowness, as though something essential is missing from within. But psychologists and psychoanalysts remind us that this inner void is not just nothingness. It has shape, weight, and meaning. It is not simply the absence of company, but a psychological and existential phenomenon that reflects the very structure of human experience. To reduce loneliness to a lack of social interaction would be to miss its depth. The inner void is not solved by merely filling a calendar with appointments or surrounding oneself with noise. It persists quietly because it represents a deeper fracture between the self and the world. Irvin Yalom, in Existential Psychotherapy, explains that existential isolation is not the same as being alone. It is an inescapable separation from others, a recognition that no matter how many connections we form, there remains a part of us that is unreachable, unique, and ultimately solitary. For Yalom, this void is not pathological. It is a fundamental aspect of existence, yet when unacknowledged, it can feel unbearable. Imagine standing in a crowded city square, voices and footsteps all around, yet sensing that no one could ever truly touch the innermost part of your being. This is the experience of the void, to be surrounded by life, but still feel apart from it. Donald Winnicott added another perspective with his idea of the unlived life. He suggested that part of our loneliness stems not only from disconnection with others, but from disconnection within ourselves. When individuals suppress their true desires, silence their authentic voices, or mold themselves into what others expect, a gap opens between who they are and who they present to the world. That gap, Winnicott believed, becomes the void. It is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of everything unsaid, unlived, and unexpressed. In that sense, loneliness is not only the absence of others, it is the absence of the self. This notion resonates with many who describe their loneliness as a constant ache rather than a sharp wound. They cannot always explain what they lack, because the void is not concrete. It is not a missing friend or a lost lover. It is a deeper yearning for authenticity, for a connection that acknowledges the truth of who they are. Rollo May, in The Courage to Create, argued that when people fail to engage authentically with life, they retreat into a state of emptiness. He wrote that emptiness is not a vacuum to be avoided, but a call to fill one's life with meaning. Here, May reframes the void not as a death sentence for the spirit, but as a space that demands to be filled, wisely, consciously, with meaning rather than distractions. Viktor Frankl took this further in his reflections on what he called the existential vacuum. In Man's Search for Meaning, he observed that modern individuals often suffer not from external deprivation, but from an internal sense of purposelessness. This vacuum manifests as boredom, apathy, or despair, but underneath it lies the same inner void that countless patients had described to him. Frankl insisted that the only way to overcome this vacuum was not to flee from it, but to confront it by discovering a sense of meaning unique to each person. In his words, when a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. Undine, this phrase captures the essence of the void. It is not merely empty space, but a powerful force that drives us toward desperate attempts to cover it with superficial experiences. One of the tragedies of misunderstanding the inner void is that society often encourages shallow remedies. We are told to stay busy, meet new people, buy something nice, or just think positive. While these strategies may provide temporary relief, they fail to address the reality of the void. A distracted life is not the same as a fulfilled one. The individual may silence their loneliness for a while, but when the distractions fade, the emptiness returns with greater intensity. The void is patient, it waits, and each time it resurfaces, it feels more urgent, more demanding, more unbearable. But the void is not always an enemy. Winnicott saw in the capacity to be alone something potentially transformative. If one can face the void without collapsing, without rushing to fill it with noise, it can become a space of creativity, growth, and authenticity. Many artists, writers, and philosophers have testified that their greatest works emerged not from comfort, but from confronting emptiness. The void, when acknowledged, can be a canvas rather than a prison. Jung echoed this when he noted that the void is full of possibilities, just as the night sky is full of stars invisible to the naked eye. The inner void is therefore more than emptiness. It is a mirror. It reflects back to us the unanswered questions of our existence. Who am I when no one is looking? What truly matters to me? Why does my life matter? These questions can feel terrifying, but they are also the keys to transformation. To stand before the void and resist the urge to run is to begin the process of self-discovery. And so, Unveiling Loneliness requires us to see the void for what it is. It is not simply a curse to be erased, but a signal pointing toward unmet needs, unspoken truths, and unlived lives. It is the echo of our humanity, reminding us that we are creatures not only of flesh and relationships, but also of meaning, authenticity, and transcendence. The void may be silent, but it speaks volumes if we have the courage to listen. Loneliness, at its core, is not just a yearning for company, but a confrontation with life's most unsettling question: what gives my existence meaning? This is why psychologists and psychoanalysts insist that the inner void cannot be healed merely through external distractions. To sit with loneliness is to face the reality that something essential is missing, yet not from the outside world, but from within. It is here that the conversation turns to Viktor Frankl, whose reflections on meaning transformed modern psychology. Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, observed that many of his patients were not suffering from clear mental illness, but from what he called the existential vacuum. They felt trapped in a state of inner emptiness, with no clear purpose to guide them. He warned that this vacuum, if left unaddressed, often gave rise to despair, aggression, or addiction. People would desperately try to numb their sense of meaninglessness with pleasure, distraction, or conformity. Ever more people today, Frankl wrote, have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. His words ring true for modern times, where loneliness often takes root, not because we lack human contact, but because our connections feel shallow, devoid of purpose. This is why loneliness so often feels unbearable. It reminds us of the gap between existence and meaning. It exposes the raw truth that without purpose, even the warmest company cannot fill the void. Consider the stories of individuals who, despite being surrounded by friends or partners, still confess to a deep loneliness. Their isolation is not about numbers, but about depth. They long not simply for people, but for encounters that affirm their sense of significance, that reassure them that their life matters beyond survival. Irvin Yalom connects this to what he calls existential isolation. He explains that while relationships can bring closeness, they cannot entirely bridge the fundamental gap between one person's inner world and another's. Each of us, he suggests, must ultimately face life alone, especially when it comes to death and meaning. Yet, paradoxically, this recognition can push us to seek richer, more authentic connections. The knowledge that no one can live our lives for us can deepen our appreciation for those who walk beside us, even if only for a time. Loneliness, then, becomes the catalyst for seeking meaning in both personal responsibility and authentic relationships. The search for meaning in loneliness also resonates with Rollo May's writings. In Man's Search for Himself, he emphasized that people often try to escape the anxiety of meaninglessness by conforming to societal roles or expectations. But this only deepens the void, because what they present to the world is not their authentic self. The result is a peculiar form of loneliness. One can be celebrated, admired, even loved, yet feel entirely unseen. To May, the antidote was courage, the courage to confront loneliness, to resist conformity, and to ask the hard questions about one's purpose. Only in this confrontation can the individual discover a life that feels genuinely their own. Psychoanalysis also teaches us that the inner void reflects not just absence, but potential. Winnicott's reflections on the true self highlight that loneliness often emerges when our lives drift too far from authenticity. The unlived aspects of the self call out to us through the ache of loneliness. In this sense, the void is like a compass, signaling that we are not yet aligned with our deepest needs. Rather than seeing loneliness only as suffering, Winnicott and others encourage us to view it as an invitation to live more fully, more honestly. Frankl himself modeled this perspective during his time in concentration camps. Surrounded by suffering and loss, he discovered that even in the most inhumane conditions, those who found meaning, whether in love, faith, or a sense of responsibility, were able to endure in ways that others could not. His insight was revolutionary. Suffering, including loneliness, is not something to escape, but something to confront with meaning. The void does not disappear, but it becomes bearable, even transformative, when it is linked to purpose. Modern psychology confirms what Frankl, Yalom, and May intuited decades ago. People who can articulate a sense of meaning through creativity, relationships, or values report lower levels of loneliness, even if they spend large amounts of time alone. Conversely, those who lack meaning often describe intense loneliness, even when constantly surrounded by others. This suggests that loneliness is not simply about connection, but about meaningful connection, connection that resonates with the deepest parts of who we are. But the search for meaning in loneliness is not an easy path. It often requires silence, reflection, and discomfort, the very things we are trained to avoid in a culture of constant distraction. Yet, as Carl Jung once remarked, loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. This inability to share what feels meaningful is what transforms solitude into despair. To overcome loneliness, then, is to find both an inner sense of purpose and, ideally, others who can understand and affirm it. Ultimately, loneliness can be seen as both a wound and a teacher. It wounds us by exposing our lack of meaning, but it teaches us by pushing us to seek a life that feels authentic and purposeful. The ache of loneliness is the ache of a soul searching for its place in the world, for a narrative that makes its existence worthwhile. If we listen closely, the void is not silence. It is a question. What will you live for? Loneliness rarely announces itself openly. More often, it hides behind carefully constructed masks, smiles, jokes, achievements, and routines that convince the world and sometimes even ourselves that everything is fine. Psychologists and psychoanalysts have long been fascinated by this phenomenon, the ways in which people disguise their inner emptiness with strategies of concealment. These masks are not worn out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that if the void were seen, it would invite rejection. Fear that to reveal our emptiness would confirm the suspicion that we are unworthy of love. And so, the masks remain, polished and convincing, while beneath them, the inner void grows. Rollo May, in his book Love and Will, spoke of the dangers of inauthentic living. He described how individuals, terrified of facing their loneliness, often create false versions of themselves, identities that conform to what society rewards, rather than what feels true. This facade may win approval, but it comes at a heavy cost. The authentic self remains hidden, silenced, and unacknowledged. May argued that this very denial deepens loneliness, because no matter how much recognition one receives, if it is directed toward the mask rather than the self, it cannot be truly felt. Applause directed at a role we play does not feed the soul. It only reminds us of the distance between who we are and who we pretend to be. Donald Winnicott's idea of the false self connects directly to this. He observed that many people, especially those who grew up in environments where their true feelings were not welcomed, learned to present only what others would accept. Over time, this adaptation crystallized into a false self, a mask designed to maintain harmony and avoid rejection. Outwardly, these individuals may appear successful, charming, or even deeply social. Inwardly, however, they feel alienated from their own being. Loneliness in this form is not just the absence of others, it is the absence of oneself. The mask becomes a prison, trapping the true self behind layers of performance. The tragedy of masks is that they often succeed too well. The world rewards competence, humor, and productivity, not vulnerability. Someone who fills their days with achievements may be praised as ambitious, when in reality they are desperately trying to outrun their sense of emptiness. Another may always be the life of the party, masking their isolation with laughter, only to return home to silence that feels unbearable. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness is not having no one around you. It is being unable to show the things that matter most to you. That inability, born of fear, is what gives birth to the mask." Yet the mask is not always conscious. Many people have worn it so long they forget what lies beneath. They may convince themselves that busyness is fulfillment, that surface-level friendships are intimacy, that fleeting pleasures are meaning. But eventually, the void pierces through. It shows itself in sudden waves of sadness, in the haunting quiet of sleepless nights, in the persistent sense that something vital is missing. This is why psychoanalysts emphasize the importance of uncovering the mask, not to shame the person for wearing it, but to help them rediscover the authenticity it conceals. The difficulty, of course, is that removing the mask feels risky. What if people see who I truly am and turn away? This is where therapy and authentic human encounters more broadly play a crucial role. Irvin Yalom, reflecting on the therapeutic relationship, argued that healing begins when the mask is lowered, when the therapist meets the patient as a fellow human being, not as a role or a diagnosis. He noted, "The experience of being deeply understood by another is perhaps the most healing aspect of therapy. This deep understanding is only possible when the mask is set aside and vulnerability is allowed to emerge." But outside of therapy, many still find themselves trapped in cycles of concealment. Social media, for example, has amplified the culture of masks. Online, people curate versions of themselves that appear endlessly happy, connected, and fulfilled, while their inner lives remain haunted by loneliness. This only deepens the sense of alienation as the distance between the image and the reality grows wider. The more convincing the mask, the lonelier the self beneath it becomes. Still, it would be a mistake to demonize masks entirely. In some ways, they are survival strategies. They allow people to function in environments that might otherwise reject or wound them. The real challenge is not to eliminate the mask, but to recognize it, to understand when it serves a purpose and when it becomes an obstacle to genuine connection. Winnicott suggested that healing begins when individuals feel safe enough to risk letting their true self emerge, even if only with one trusted other. In that moment, the mask loosens and the void begins to lose its grip. To unveil loneliness, then, is also to unveil the masks we wear. It is to ask, who am I behind the roles I perform? What do I long to share but fear will not be accepted? These questions are unsettling, but they are the doorway to authenticity. And authenticity is the only soil in which true connection can grow. The mask protects us, but it also isolates us. To remove it, even partially, is to risk being seen, but it is also the only way to be truly loved. Loneliness hides behind the laughter of the comedian, the success of the executive, the kindness of the caregiver, the energy of the friend who is always fine. But to live only behind the mask is to live in exile from one's own soul. And exile, however well hidden, is still loneliness. The path to healing requires courage, the courage to set aside the performance, to let the cracks show, and to trust that beneath the mask there is a self worthy of being seen. If loneliness is the silent weight that presses against the human soul, then authentic connection is the breath of air that relieves it. But it is important to understand what kind of connection has this transformative power. Not every relationship eases the void. Many connections, though plentiful, remain superficial, what the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm called pseudo-relationships, in which people interact not as full selves, but as roles, masks, or commodities. Authentic relationships, by contrast, are encounters where both individuals dare to be vulnerable, to reveal not just their polished exteriors, but also their fears, flaws, and longings. These relationships do not eliminate existential loneliness entirely, but they offer moments of profound relief where the inner void feels less like a prison and more like a space that can be shared. Irvin Yalom, in The Gift of Therapy, insists that one of the most powerful antidotes to the void is the experience of genuine human encounter. He emphasizes that healing emerges not through abstract techniques, but through the presence of another who listens deeply, who sees the person behind the mask. Yalom writes, "A deep, interpersonal connection can relieve isolation, even if it is temporary. For many, it is the first time they have truly been seen." This experience of being seen and accepted touches something deeper than companionship. It confirms our existence in the eyes of another, reassuring us that our inner world matters and is worthy of recognition. Donald Winnicott's ideas about the good enough mother extend beautifully to this theme. For Winnicott, what nurtures a child's capacity to exist authentically is not perfection, but the presence of someone who responds to their needs with genuine care. Later in life, authentic relationships function in a similar way. They provide a holding environment where the true self can emerge without fear of rejection. In such spaces, loneliness begins to soften because the individual no longer feels compelled to hide behind the false self. Authenticity, once risky, becomes possible in the light of trust. But why are authentic relationships so rare? Part of the answer lies in the masks discussed earlier. When two people meet mask to mask, they may interact endlessly without ever truly touching one another. They may share laughter, stories, or even years together, yet remain strangers at the core. To move beyond this requires courage, the courage to risk revealing vulnerability. Rollo May described this as the essence of intimacy, the willingness to confront the anxiety of exposure in order to meet another soul more deeply. Without this risk, connections remain shallow. With it, they become transformative. Viktor Frankl adds another dimension, the role of love in discovering meaning. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that through love, a person can see into the essential core of another, perceiving their potential even when it has not yet been realized. Love, in this sense, is not merely emotion, but recognition. It affirms the value of existence and thus counteracts the despair of loneliness. Frankl recalled that even in the darkest hours of the concentration camp, the thought of his wife, his connection to her, gave him strength and preserved his humanity. Authentic relationships, therefore, do more than ease loneliness. They anchor us in meaning, yet authentic connection does not only exist in romantic or family bonds. It can appear between friends, colleagues, or even strangers who, for a brief moment, truly share themselves. Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, described authenticity in relationships as congruence, the state of being genuine rather than performing. Rogers argued that when one person dares to be congruent, it invites the other to lower their defenses too, creating a cycle of openness that nurtures both. This reciprocity transforms loneliness into togetherness, not by erasing isolation, but by illuminating it with shared humanity. Still, authentic relationships cannot be manufactured on demand. They require patience, presence, and above all, willingness. They flourish when both people embrace silence as much as words, when listening becomes as important as speaking, when judgment gives way to curiosity. These qualities may sound simple, but in a world obsessed with speed and image, they are profoundly radical. To sit with someone in their pain without trying to fix it, to celebrate someone's joy without envy, to accept someone's flaws without withdrawal, these are the marks of authenticity. Psychoanalysis teaches us that such relationships heal, not because they fix the void, but because they allow us to bear it together. Yalom acknowledges that existential isolation will never fully disappear, but through genuine connection, its sharp edges can be softened. The void becomes less suffocating when it is spoken aloud and met with empathy. Loneliness thrives in secrecy. It weakens in the presence of authenticity. Perhaps the most powerful truth is that authentic relationships do not require perfection. They require honesty. They require the willingness to be present. In the end, what saves us from drowning in the void is not the quantity of people around us, but the quality of connection we cultivate with even one or two souls who see us as we are. These connections remind us that while we are ultimately alone in existence, we do not have to be alone in living. Thus, the path from void to connection is not about escaping loneliness altogether, but about transforming it. When loneliness drives us to seek authenticity, it ceases to be only a burden and becomes a guide. It shows us what we long for: real encounters, real meaning, real presence. And in those moments of truth, however fleeting, the void no longer feels empty, it feels alive. If loneliness is the silent weight that presses against the human soul, then authentic connection is the breath of air that relieves it. But it is important to understand what kind of connection has this transformative power. Not every relationship eases the void. Many connections, though plentiful, remain superficial, what the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm called pseudo-relationships, in which people interact not as full selves but as roles, masks, or commodities. Authentic relationships, by contrast, are encounters where both individuals dare to be vulnerable, to reveal not just their polished exteriors, but also their fears, flaws, and longings. These relationships do not eliminate existential loneliness entirely, but they offer moments of profound relief where the inner void feels less like a prison and more like a space that can be shared. Irvin Yalom, in The Gift of Therapy, insists that one of the most powerful antidotes to the void is the experience of genuine human encounter. He emphasizes that healing emerges not through abstract techniques, but through the presence of another who listens deeply, who sees the person behind the mask. Yalom writes, "A deep interpersonal connection can relieve isolation, even if it is temporary. For many, it is the first time they have truly been seen." This experience of being seen and accepted touches something deeper than companionship. It confirms our existence in the eyes of another, reassuring us that our inner world matters and is worthy of recognition. Donald Winnicott's ideas about the good enough mother extend beautifully to this theme. For Winnicott, what nurtures a child's capacity to exist authentically is not perfection, but the presence of someone who responds to their needs with genuine care. Later in life, authentic relationships function in a similar way. They provide a holding environment where the true self can emerge without fear of rejection. In such spaces, loneliness begins to soften because the individual no longer feels compelled to hide behind the false self. Authenticity, once risky, becomes possible in the light of trust. But why are authentic relationships so rare? Part of the answer lies in the masks discussed earlier. When two people meet mask to mask, they may interact endlessly without ever truly touching one another. They may share laughter, stories, or even years together, yet remain strangers at the core. To move beyond this requires courage, the courage to risk revealing vulnerability. Rollo May described this as the essence of intimacy, the willingness to confront the anxiety of exposure in order to meet another soul more deeply. Without this risk, connections remain shallow. With it, they become transformative. Viktor Frankl adds another dimension, the role of love in discovering meaning. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that through love, a person can see into the essential core of another, perceiving their potential even when it has not yet been realized. Love, in this sense, is not merely emotion, but recognition. It affirms the value of existence and thus counteracts the despair of loneliness. Frankl recalled that even in the darkest hours of the concentration camp, the thought of his wife, his connection to her, gave him strength and preserved his humanity. Authentic relationships, therefore, do more than ease loneliness. They anchor us in meaning. Yet authentic connection does not only exist in romantic or family bonds. It can appear between friends, colleagues, or even strangers who, for a brief moment, truly share themselves. Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, described authenticity in relationships as congruence, the state of being genuine rather than performing. Rogers argued that when one person dares to be congruent, it invites the other to lower their defenses too, creating a cycle of openness that nurtures both. This reciprocity transforms loneliness into togetherness, not by erasing isolation, but by illuminating it with shared humanity. Still, authentic relationships cannot be manufactured on demand. They require patience, presence, and above all, willingness. They flourish when both people embrace silence as much as words, when listening becomes as important as speaking, when judgment gives way to curiosity. These qualities may sound simple, but in a world obsessed with speed and image, they are profoundly radical. To sit with someone in their pain without trying to fix it, to celebrate someone's joy without envy, to accept someone's flaws without withdrawal, these are the marks of authenticity. Psychoanalysis teaches us that such relationships heal not because they fix the void, but because they allow us to bear it together. Yalom acknowledges that existential isolation will never fully disappear, but through genuine connection, its sharp edges can be softened. The void becomes less suffocating when it is spoken aloud and met with empathy. Loneliness thrives in secrecy. It weakens in the presence of authenticity. Perhaps the most powerful truth is that authentic relationships do not require perfection. They require honesty. They require the willingness to be present. In the end, what saves us from drowning in the void is not the quantity of people around us, but the quality of connection we cultivate with even one or two souls who see us as we are. These connections remind us that while we are ultimately alone in existence, we do not have to be alone in living. Thus, The path from void to connection is not about escaping loneliness altogether, but about transforming it. When loneliness drives us to seek authenticity, it ceases to be only a burden and becomes a guide. It shows us what we long for: real encounters, real meaning, real presence. And in those moments of truth, however fleeting, the void no longer feels empty. It feels alive. To speak of loneliness is to speak of pain, silence, and emptiness, but it is also to speak of possibility. While loneliness often begins as a wound, psychoanalysts and existential thinkers remind us that it can also be a doorway. Within the void lies not only despair, but also the raw material for transformation. The challenge is not to eliminate loneliness entirely, because existential isolation will always remain, but to learn how to live with it in ways that deepen rather than diminish our existence. Viktor Frankl's writings provide one of the clearest maps for this transformation. In Man's Search for Meaning, he describes how even in the depths of the concentration camp, people could choose their attitude towards suffering. They could decide whether despair would consume them or whether they would use suffering as a means of discovering inner strength and meaning. Loneliness, too, can be reinterpreted in this way. It may feel like a void, but Frankl would argue that the void is really a question, a demand for meaning. If we can meet that demand, loneliness shifts from being a threat to being an opportunity. It becomes the space in which we ask, what truly matters to me? What kind of life do I want to create? Donald Winnicott complements this perspective with his idea of the capacity to be alone. For him, the ability to tolerate solitude without collapsing into despair is a developmental achievement. It means that the individual carries within themselves an internalized sense of safety and connection, even when physically alone. In this light, loneliness does not always need to be feared. It can be the ground on which creativity, reflection, and authenticity flourish. Think of artists, poets, and thinkers who have drawn from solitude to create works that touch millions. Their loneliness did not destroy them. It became the soil from which meaning grew. Irvin Yalom expands this idea by framing loneliness as an inevitable part of existence. Since no one can live our lives for us or die in our place, we are ultimately isolated beings. But Yalom suggests that this truth, rather than leading only to despair, can also push us toward more authentic living. When we accept that life is finite and our loneliness cannot be erased, we may begin to live more urgently, more honestly. We may dare to pursue the relationships, passions, and values that feel real, rather than wasting time on masks or distractions. In this sense, loneliness is not the enemy of life. It is the reminder of its preciousness. Rollo May saw something similar in the anxiety that often accompanies loneliness. For him, anxiety was not simply pathological, but a signal that growth was possible. If we run from loneliness, it festers, but if we face it, it can propel us toward greater depth. He argued that the emptiness we fear is often the birthplace of courage. To stand in the void without rushing to escape is to discover inner resources we never knew we had. It is in this confrontation that people often find their voice, their art, or their true direction. Transforming loneliness into growth, however, does not mean romanticizing it. Loneliness can be devastating when ignored, especially when people lack the resources to face it. The transformation begins only when loneliness is named, accepted, and engaged with consciously. This might mean turning to therapy, journaling, meditation, or honest conversations with trusted others. It might mean choosing to sit in silence, resisting the urge to fill every moment with noise, and allowing the void to reveal its hidden lessons. As Carl Jung observed, the greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown. Loneliness in this sense is not solved by erasing it, but by outgrowing the fear it provokes. One of the paradoxes of growth is that when we allow loneliness to teach us, we often emerge with a deeper capacity for connection. Having faced our own void, we become more attuned to the void in others. We become capable of listening without judgment, of sitting with another's silence without rushing to fix it. In this way, our loneliness becomes a bridge. What once separated us now connects us because it awakens compassion. The wound becomes the source of empathy. The emptiness becomes a shared human space. And so loneliness transforms from curse to companion. It still appears during long nights, transitions, or moments of loss, but we no longer fear it as we once did. We recognize it as part of the human condition, and we know that within its silence lies the potential for renewal. As Frankl, Winnicott, Yalom, and May each remind us in different ways, the inner void is not just absence. It is a space waiting to be filled with meaning, authenticity, and connection. To run from it is to remain trapped. To face it is to grow. Ultimately, unveiling loneliness is unveiling ourselves. It is the courage to say, I feel empty, and yet I am still here. I feel isolated, and yet I am still capable of love. I am alone, and yet my life can still be filled with meaning. In embracing these paradoxes, loneliness loses its power to destroy. Instead, it becomes what it was always meant to be, not the end of the story, but the beginning of transformation. If this exploration of loneliness and the inner void resonated with you, don't let the conversation end here. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join our community, where we uncover the deepest truths of the human mind together. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. Every week we dive into psychology, meaning and personal growth, bringing insights from experts like Yalom, Frankl, and Jung directly to you. Click subscribe and continue this journey of understanding, connection, and transformation.